back, everyone, to another episode of Kingdom of Dreams podcast, The Making of Stories. I'm your host, Rod here. I just finished wrapping up talking to production designer Alex McDowell. For those of you who don't know who he is, he's worked on films like The Fight Club, Minority Report, The Terminal, The Crow, B-Movie, The Cat in the Hat, and many more. It was a really, really fascinating conversation, but this one particularly focused on Minority Report and the technology in Minority Report and the future in Minority Report. Really had a pleasure talking to him, and he's agreed to come back again to talk about his other films. We'll figure out what that would be, but please do take a listen and watch this. Enjoy the conversation with Alex McDowell. 25 years now, and it's amazing how things that were shown in that film, obviously based on a short novel, are sort of coming true now, or have been for the last little while. I would love to know how your involvement on that project started, just to kind of kick off this conversation.
Yes, I mean, I think quite simply from the beginning, when I was hired pretty much on the same day as Scott Frank, the writer.
Mm,
Um, it was clear that a script had come with being directed when Steve took over. Um, but when I started, as I say, Scott Frank started at the same time because Stephen wanted to completely rewrite the script. Excuse me. Um, so that was in itself unusual. You know, most films are not going to get started at all unless there's a script that's been approved, as you know. But being Mr. Spielberg, he didn't really have to ask permission. And we had the directive. I mean, what I remember is getting about a half-page synopsis that was an overview of the script that Stephen wanted to tell, and it was quite different from the novel, which is, you know, that it remains very different from the original Philip K. Dick novel, but it did have the setup of Washington, D.C., 50 years in the future, three precogs in the center of the of the narrative, and this dome of protection that they offered to the city. Um, and that's what we had. And he said, you know, while we're writing the script, what would be great is for you guys to go ahead and build a world. And so with those sort of relatively simple frameworks and a couple of other things, which is he wanted it to be a benign, apparently benign future, so that the audience was surprised when it turned into something that was less benign. And also very specifically, he didn't want it to be science fiction. He wanted the audience to believe that this was a world that really existed. And there was no kind of escaping that politically, if you like. So that directive particularly sent us on the path of a different kind of research than an art department and a designer might normally do, which was to go out into the world and go really deep. Um, and Spielberg's name gave us a key into the kind of places that you might normally not have access to, like the military research at DARPA, or into Apple Research Labs, or into MIT Media Lab and those kind of places. So we had this unique access, and we had specific questions to ask. And it was all about, what do you think, or, you know, where's your research taking us? And so the beginning of the film was really that, was like, go out into the world and discover what we can about the way the future is leaning, or the way that current research and intent is leaning towards a visionary future. That was hand in hand with a small group that Stephen brought in early on, who were experts and who were experts in various different fields, and kind of launched some of that early direction, and actually also gave us access. So we had Neil Gershenfeld, a quantum physicist from MIT, who gave us that boost, you know, into the Media Lab. But it was also instrumental as a consultant in the technology of the precogs, if you like. He was actually the tell me if I'm sort of going off on tangents
No,
here,
no,
which
you're
I
fine. I'm intrigued. Please keep going.
clearly we clearly am. But yeah, so Neil Gershenfeld, as I say, quantum physicist, we asked him uh, how should we consider the notion of precognition, and he said, I've never been asked to do it, but I can probably solve that problem. So um, we were engaged at that level, you know, of people who were really thinking deeply about the possibility of these fictional concepts being feasible. Uh, so that was the setup, and the script took quite a long time to develop, and probably around 12 months. So we were developing the world hand in hand. You know, I mean, we certainly weren't just building a world in a vacuum. We were reporting back to Stephen, and then he would come back to us with narrative ideas that were evolving for the script. And so it was this very integral kind of integrated process. And it seemed, you know, as it developed, it seemed like the right way to make movies. You know, it was um, not being presented with a script that very often you have to kind of, as a designer, throw away. You know, because it's dealing with all of the storytelling ideas, but the context is something that we have to consider from the ground up as a designer. In this case, we sort of flipped the model and actually radically flipped the model by having the world first. We were coming up with frameworks for conceptual ideas that would not have come up, I believe, ever, you know, in a with a writer who was sitting in a bungalow in Echo Park in LA, you know, writing 96 pages, um, because we had a you know a much larger resource to pull from. So there would be a number of scenes in the film that existed because they stimulated the narrative, and they allowed the narrative to exist because of discoveries we made in the world. Um, in some ways, it's closer to the way a writer would work on a story that was contemporary, where they would
Hmm.
be going out into the streets and they'd be pulling ideas from the reality of the world that we live in. We had to build a world that was immersive enough to allow Scott and Stephen to step inside it, essentially.
Yeah. No, thank you so much for all that detailed information because Minority Report, I mean, it's just one of those films. And one of the things that you said that making the audience connected to the film by not making it way too science fiction. And that's one of the things I loved about Minority Report because, and that goes to production design specifically, is because you had all these futuristic elements in the world that existed even today. Right, like a bunch of homes on a street in Washington D.C., or could be the car plant where they built the specific special text Lexus, I think, if my memory serves me right. And so there was all these real components, which really, and then obviously the story at the core, right? Of just a man trying to prove himself innocent. And I'm really fascinated about what you said about Apple. Is that something that if you're able to talk about, what did you learn at Apple in terms of that? At the time, Apple wasn't as big, right?
Mm.
It was pre-iPod. I think it was just about pre-iPod age that it was in. What did you guys discover there that helped shape the film in any way?
You know, I think places like Apple were giving a framework for thinking about the future in a
Mm,
different way. You know, they certainly weren't handing over
of
um,
course.
products that were in the research lab. Um, Actually, you know, the huge flaw in our future vision was that there were no cell phones. So actually, that Apple would have been helpful if they'd actually let us know that cell phones were going to be pervasive. But uh, no, I think it was, you know, in some specific places when we were going to Lexus and we had permission to redesign their vehicles, um, because that was a focus, you know, like how do you drive in the city?
Mm,
We were and we had this license to redesign a product like that and have them brand it. We were considering what is a vehicle, how do you drive, what is driving, what is it, how does that work in a future city, in a city that is very vertical because there's been this massive influx of population who want protection under the umbrella of the precogs. And so this huge influx of population needs a new city. That was a big part of our design, was going to architects directly and saying, how do another layer of research was we weren't inventing a city as a fictional space. We were going, well, how would a city develop? What would the new design processes of architecture, the first kind of parametric designs that were coming out of Frank Geary's office or out of Greg Lynn's office. So we had that kind of thing going on, like, well, how does a city function? And one of those things was, if Tom Cruise lives at the top of the city and he goes to work in old DC, how does he get there? I mean, I'm getting into a lot of detail here, but I was very interested in something we discovered, which is the height of buildings is only constrained by the number of elevators it can contain. At some point, the footprint is taken up with so many elevators that there's no room for the building. So so that sparked the idea of, well, what if your car was an elevator, and therefore, what if your car can move vertically? A little bit of like, what if your car was part of your living room?
Mm-hmm.
But mostly, how would a car move vertically and horizontally? And that set up some questions about designing a car that was capable of that, which was very, very specific to the final design, because only certain shapes can actually accommodate that vertical and horizontal and rotate. And the other part we considered was, what if you didn't have to drive? What if it was a combination of an elevator and a taxi cab? So we stumbled into autonomy, essentially. I mean, a decade before autonomous vehicles were on anybody's chart, because we were just asking questions that were logical. And I would say that it's become fundamental to, really has become fundamental to world building, is that your research has to embed itself in a provable logic.
Yeah.
So on the whole, the hover ships are probably pushing the edge of scientific possibility, but on the whole, we were considering the finest level of detail, and that's how the gesture controlled screens came up, because we were going to scientists. We met an engineer at MIT Media Lab who was doing that for his thesis project, and literally pitched a gesture-based interface to Stephen, and then we integrated the real, essentially real technology. The part of it that was traditional film magic was that we were able to put it on a transparent screen, and we were not bound by the thing that I think dates movies is often the monitors, right? In 2001 or in Fight
Mm-hmm.
Club, I'm sorry, in Blade Runner, very specifically dated by the kind of technology that they were using to do in-camera screen graphics, where we had, because of the gesture and because it was a fictional piece of technology at that moment, we had to produce CG overlaid screens, and therefore they don't date. Um, but yeah, I think that that was every question that was being asked about robotics or eye transplants or how precogs could exist. Uh, every piece of that kind of future-facing technology, the notion of excuse me, the notion of targeted advertising. I mean, Amazon was maybe 2 years old in
Yeah.
2000.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, Came from, again, work that we saw at MIT Media Lab, which was very specifically directed towards how would you do that local targeting. Um, And so having that concept in our minds at the very, very, early stages of that research allowed us to extrapolate to, well, what if it was pervasive? Um, and again, you kind of, by going through that logic, what we were doing was just having this opportunity, because we're dealing with fiction, of a kind of design fiction process where we're leaping ahead based on logic. Um, but we're really going through exactly the process they're going through in the research lab. We just get to be able to accelerate it. So I would say,
Yeah.
we weren't being clever. We were just paying attention, listening carefully.
I mean, you guys pretty much. I never thought about the phones. Now that you mentioned it, it never occurred to me that there's no phones, but pretty much everything else you guys nailed. I mean, you look at the screens with gesture movement. You look at the scene in the subway where Cameron Crowe is holding a newspaper and the news gets updated live. I mean, not necessarily in that way, but now you have tablets and internet and all that stuff. The robotics and autonomous cars, as you said, and obviously, I think one of the most coolest and scariest sequence in the entire film is a Spidey sequence, right? Where those three Spideys, I think they're called, come in and try to just to retina scan Tom Cruise's character. What was that sort of part of your realm too, in terms of bringing that to, and talk about that if that's the case? How did that concept start? Because
Yeah.
I think that's the coolest thing in the film for me, at least.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I mean, all of this was being, questions that were being asked, as they would be with any script at some point, and I don't remember when. I'm sure by that time it was a very specific narrative detail
Right,
that Stephen wanted to have in the film. Um, but it's always the job of the art department to get into that level of design detail.
right,
Uh, if or it should be, maybe it isn't always, but we were designing some of those things 3 years before visual effects, came on board really. So,
mm,
because we were working, well, 2 years, right? Because we were working starting in 2000. Film came out in 2002, so we had a full year of development, and then visual effects would have been 6 months afterwards, I guess. But yeah, again, we were working with the robotics lab at MIT Media Lab. I keep coming back to MIT because they were the most generous in opening up to the labs, and I think because they're doing educational research, the questions we were asking were the right kind of questions to go into a kind of PhD environment. Um, so if you're saying where are robots going, um, I saw still a piece of AI animation today in LinkedIn of a robot that was basically behaving as the Spideys, and it's still not there in terms of the technology. I mean, 6 months ago, I saw a vertical um, public transport system that could go vertically and horizontally. Uh, we do see that it is 20, 25 years later that is still coming out. Um, but it was very much, as I said, I mean, we were very lucky to have access.
mm,
And because we were thinking this future reality directive demanded that we paid attention to a real uh, again, extrapolating forward from the things that
right,
even if they were speculative.
right. Okay. I'll tell you one little story before I ask you next question. So, I don't know if I should be saying this, but it's too late now. When Minority Report came out, about 3, 4 years before that, I started this website on DreamWorks. It was a Spielberg website, but it turned into DreamWorks. Like when Amazon was brand new, internet was brand new, and it blew up. Like it blew up to a point where I was visiting movie sets, press junkets, at a very young age. And I remember I received an email from a guy who worked at a movie theater, and he said, I have access to the Minority Report trailer, and it wasn't released yet. It was just a theater chain that received it. So I asked him if he's willing to digitize it, which back then was like a big deal, and send it to me. And he did. And then I posted it, and my server went down. And then I got a letter from 20th Century Fox about
I'm
copyright
sure you
infringement,
did.
which was the first time I ever knew what that meant. Like, 'cause, you just didn't realize that was the case. But that kind of that's how my Minority Report personally is connected to me because I've sort of going through that. But that film itself, Alex, is just has so many. Does it fascinate you, like, or does it scare you that the things that you guys did in that film, whether it's through screenwriting or production designing, and Spielberg's vision, is in the last 23 years has been slowly coming true, and it's probably even beyond that now?
I would say kind of the opposite. I mean, what has happened in my design space in my career since Minority Report was a reconsideration of whether you could essentially build anticipatory worlds um, on the basis of this notion of a platform of research. And what we know, because I've been doing just that for 25 years since then, I've used and developed a world building methodology, which is specifically designed to do that extrapolation forward. So the work we generally do in my studio now, because I teach, so I'm not doing productions, I'm not production
Mm,
design at the moment, or just intermittently. Um, the work we're doing with corporations, for example, we're working 10, 15, 20, 75 years forward. And our work is just that, is like if you build a logical world, you can make very viable assumptions. And then you can move forward into not executing them to the level of making them into films, but executing them to the level of nevertheless of immersion. I mean, we've made games that are set in 75-year future cities as teaching tools for undergrad students in American universities. We try all of the time. We're now taking that very real capability and using it to prompt different ways of thinking about the future. So I think if you were to take Minority Report as a way of, well, to a large extent, it's a very dystopian view of the city of the future, as it turns out. Um, you can look at that as a way of warning the world what could be happening, or you could say, let's steer it towards how it could be benign, how it could be a a viable but better world, just to be slightly prosaic about it. Our world building methodology hasn't actually changed much from Minority Report because the amount of input you get when you're doing deep research finds a balance, right? Because you have different viewpoints coming in, you have different types of expertise kind of bringing ideas together, and it balances. And so another thing I think that was true in Minority Report is that we were being challenged to make it right because there were different inputs coming in from the outside saying this wouldn't work or this wouldn't work. When we bring 20, 30, 40, 70 experts together to look at a near future world in fantasy or in fiction or in a kind of projected reality, we're finding this balanced futures which are believable because they're not utopian and they're not fully
mm,
dystopian. Unless the question being demanded is what would it look like if it was full dystopia? But if you're really doing a projected world based on balanced but very intensive research, then you end up with a level of reality because you're just testing it all of the time. So it's a process I teach. It's a process that we use in every way in every design challenge I get. Um, and
mm,
it works in some very simple way because we're saying if you walk out into the world outside your front door, there are 1,000 factors at play. So all you have to do is kind of understand that that's true, whether it's present reality, past or future. You always have to consider all of these intersecting coexistent realities. So you can build a world that is like Minority Report, got a very high level, high income space and a very low income space, and you can find that as you can look at the spectrum of that. You can look at the spectrum of scale. A house in 50 years is not going to suddenly look sci-fi. When we but our devices might be. You might have Internet of Things running
Yeah.
your stove and your lighting, and then your cell phone, as we discover, becomes this potent and rapidly updating piece of sci-fi. Essentially, it's always on the edge of being its own future. So that sort of notion of scale in relation to time is also interesting. So we're looking at a kind of what I would call a 5D world all the time now, because all of these factors are in play.
Yeah. No, that's true. And I want to go back to Minority Report. Before I do, I'm always curious about people's journey of why they became who they wanted to become or how they became who they are in terms of you being production designer. What was your journey like in terms of getting into that world? Was it a specific movie that you saw? You always wanted to be production designer? Was it something else? If you can talk about that briefly.
Yeah. Well, what I would say is don't anybody try and follow the path that I took, because it's a complete series of accidents. I was
Mm,
not um I mean, I would say the transformational piece for me that was cinema focused was seeing a Tarkovsky festival in London,
mm,
um, because it connected directly to my experience of growing up in Malaysia, and being in a this kind of push and pull between history, decay, and future. But my background was I went to art school as a painter. I was doing fine art. I was um, engaged in a very sort of traditional route towards being a painter, and then I saw the Sex Pistols, and my sort of viewpoint of the world shifted right away. It was like, well, the what's really going on in the world that's engaging in the level of change that we had to consider in Margaret Thatcher Britain, um, was being manifested in music, not in art. And so I shifted, and not as a musician, but as a artist, I shifted into design and narrative design for record sleeves and framing what the narratives of the bands were. And then that migrated into music videos, because we were there in London when the very first music videos were being made, and Iggy Pop said, "Can you make us a music video?" And I had no idea what a music video was, and I said, "Of course we can." And then, and so I was a production designer, the first thing I ever did. And I've never, I've only ever done what I do, but you're being challenged. I came to the US in '86 because there was so much music video work here,
mm.
in LA. And then those directors like David Fincher started doing commercials at the very highest level. So I moved into commercials with them. And then uh, Alex Proyas. I mean, I did a film called Lawnmower Man before Alex Proyas, but that was a slightly different route. It was someone coming out of Silicon Valley, actually, Brett Leonard, who was interested in virtual reality and wanted to make a movie about it, um, which was crazy predictive in the sense that I now run a lab at USC which only deals with virtual reality.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
with the same scientist at NASA who brought me in and showed me these massive virtual reality rigs, and $70,000 machines, brought me into USC ultimately 20 years later. But um, uh, Yes. So anyway, yeah, it's music videos, and then The Crow was really the first um,
Yeah,
point at which I was fully dedicated. I didn't go back to commercials, I don't think, after The Crow, and The
right.
Crow was offering open doors to a different level of filmmaking because it was such a powerful film and people recognize it, and it was noticed. Um, and then going back to working with David Fincher, which has always been, both in the commercials, music videos, and in film, the most precise challenge. Just, I mean, David is a he works in a different space than any other director I've worked with in terms of the level of precision and detail and specificity about the shots he wants. And so as a designer, you really have to pay attention. Um, Not that there weren't other very complicated
Yeah.
movies out there, but that's kind of the trajectory, this what I would call falling forward. Um, and that led to teaching as well. I had no intention to be a teacher, but it just came across at the right time. And I didn't have any intention of building worlds for giant corporations, but that also just kind of came out of Minority Report actually very directly. So one accident after another, really.
That's so fascinating. I wonder, when you worked with David Fincher on music videos, were you involved with propaganda films a lot, like Michael Bay and a whole bunch of other
Yeah,
individuals who
that's
are
where
part
I
of that?
was working.
Gore
Yeah.
Verbinski, I think. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. And I
amazing.
worked with a number of those directors. I mean, Alex Proyas was there, David Fincher was there, Gore I worked with. Didn't ever work with Michael Bay, but a lot of young directors, some of whom became known and some of them less so. It was an amazing, I mean, propaganda was really like they just grabbed the best of everything out there. So, but I was working like 7 days a week with Fincher for a year. So it was really just, an intense learning process for me.
Did you work with Vadim Perlman?
No.
No. Okay. Yeah, he did. I think he was part of propaganda films. He did House of Sand and Fog. I don't know if
Oh,
you have
yeah.
seen it.
Okay.
It was a
Mhm.
great movie. I don't know what he's done. Only like very handful of films, but a great storyteller. Um,
Mm.
Going back to Minority Report, the whole concept or the hook of the story is predicting the crime before it occurs, right? Um,
Yeah.
I don't know if where I was reading this or it was a podcast where there was a country that was already sort of not necessarily from a standpoint of precogs, kind of figuring out a way how crime is committed before it's committed by precisely figuring out people's social media data and how they're operating and what they're posting, and somehow running that through a system which somehow not necessarily predict, but can semi-predict that this can happen or he or she can do something.
Yeah.
Do you think that's possible in our lifetimes? Like
Oh,
the way
yeah.
Minority Report has done it?
More than possible. I think we have a regime in this country that is using that methodology to um, arrest people before they were ever going to do a crime. I think that there is no question. I mean, it's that is an interesting question because we've actually been spending a lot of time looking at that with a film called Mercy that I
Mm,
just finished designing with Timur Bekmambetov, that was looking at an AI legal system that's pulling evidence to do exactly that, to basically accuse people based on threads of evidence weaving together because it's an AI who has access to the dark web and to everything and is just grabbing pieces of evidence and putting them together. In our process of research there, we were looking at surveillance technologies, that can track 100 faces in a single frame,
yeah.
like uh, identify everybody who's on a march at the same time, but your point of following the kind of arc of narrative that is just being kind of people are putting themselves out on the line without understanding it, right? In social
Yeah.
media, they know the implication of joining the dots. But you or I could look at a thread of social media over a period of a few months and understand much more about that person than they might be revealed. And that would just be from an absolute lay point of view. So if you're applying, again, this is Bill Mercy, you're setting up a condition which might be science fiction, but it might also be reality because we don't really know anymore whether that technology is in play. Um, the chances are, well, Singapore is using AI legal system for traffic violation right now.
Mm.
So it only has to step up a little bit to get to murder, which was the theme of the film we were doing.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a the facial recognition technology. I did a film uh, about I'm not sure if you've heard of the Uyghurs in the northwestern part of China,
Yeah,
and
right.
so I did a whole film on that in search of my sister, and in one of the aspects of that was they have the facial technology, which if they have, then everybody else will have down the road, or they already have, where it can
Yeah,
specifically identify the ethnicity of the individual, not just like
mm,
their who they are, but their actual just by looking at their facial features, it can, and this was like 5 years ago, so I can only
yeah,
imagine what it is right now. Um,
yeah,
and and you talked about mercy, which now I'm fascinated to see because that is, I mean, it's kind of like AI right now. If you go to Perplexity or ChatGPT, all it's doing is collecting information from the web, right?
yeah,
But to be able
exactly.
to identify people's likes and comments and then just combine them all into something that could potentially be whatever, it's kind of scary because most of the people, most if not majority of the people will be innocent and
Yeah,
they're
yeah.
because they're expressing themselves.
I think we can assume 100% that anyone who has been targeted can be tracked to that level of detail. And false assumptions can be made. I mean, that's the whole premise of Mercy is that the AI puts things together without all the information, without under. Something we're very preoccupied with AI is that my own feeling is that what I would call kind of ironically our stupidity, is untrackable. Like the decisions that we make that are based on intuition and on reaction and on a set of absolutely immeasurable moments that are around us that we are constantly reacting to. I believe when you come down to the human scale, which is a big part of what I am focused on in world building, is like how do you tell stories from 6 foot off the ground, not from 1,000 feet? Um, that we make mistakes. We thrive on, I was just describing my career path. There's not a single planned moment in any of that. Um,
Yeah,
so how is an AI going to track my actual reality? Which is why I think the mistakes, if you like, will be made constantly because they're going to be based on models, not on the stupidity of us, of our individual natures,
yeah,
that um, and so at that point, this alliance is necessary, right? We don't necessarily understand AI and they don't understand us, but there's an augmentation that is quite valuable if you can put those two things together without, and adapt as we always have to new tools. But
yeah.
um, but yeah, our survival, I think, has always been based on our unpredictability.
I couldn't agree more. And I think what's really crazy now, films that came out in the 90s or 80s, like, Blade Runner, Total Recall, Judge Dredd, you have Strange Days, you have Minority Report. I mean, there's so many of them. Matrix. Um, kind of seems to be coming true now, more or less. And where are we heading in terms of,
Mm,
how much independence do we have? Forget about from, having a freedom of expression in terms of from governments, but even with AI or machine versus human.
mhm, mhm.
And yeah, that's the part that fascinates me, but at the same time, it does it is a little bit something to be concerned about, I think. And
Mhm.
how do we overcome that? I don't know. I don't know. Maybe it's just the way of evolution is.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, and I think, don't you think that it's inevitable that storytellers who are paying attention, which is where good films come from, are going to make they're going to join the dots, right?
Yeah,
So Matrix is based on a set of conditions, very grounded in reality that are just extrapolated forward. Um, Blade Runner the same. You see this always fascinated by that scene in Blade Runner where he is looking at a photograph through the screen and he goes, push in coordinate XY3, turn
yeah,
left, right? And right now, I mean, my students are driving AI that can go into a photographic image and turn left. It's when we see AI will do exactly that. It'll extrapolate everything you need from 2D into 3D and 4D
yeah,
um and all I'm saying there is that I think anybody who's paying attention and using intelligence is going to be intuitively and unconsciously developing a knowledge of the future because everyone is speculating. And mostly they're probably right because they have access to incredibly detailed information by stepping outside the door and buying an apple. So um, so the dystopian part of it is a filter that the filmmaker puts on that because that's the story they want to tell, and
yeah.
dystopia is more interesting than utopia, and tension is better in narrative. Um, but I think that's interesting and perhaps something we don't pay enough attention to because that would be my thesis is that storytelling is how we track where the world is going, just by extrapolating forward. Um, but but in terms of that reality and how we protect ourselves from it, yeah, I think we adapt, like you protect yourself
100%.
from wolves.
100%. Before we wrap up, I just if I know it's been a long time, if you can remember anything interesting from working on Minority Report. It doesn't have to be like science related, just like the story on the set or in pre-production or anything that gave you guys hard time and overcoming that. I would love to hear just one of those stories.
I mean, very much in the film. I mean, just it's a interesting question because this isn't about the narrative. This is about production reality. So, but it also engages technology. We That spider scene that you
Mm,
mentioned was very complex, right? Because it was one take. And so it goes up, a level and it goes across a number of rooms above. And the reach is extreme, right? It's moving a long way, 25, 30 feet in the air, on a set on stage, where the roofs have been taken off. So the issue was how does a super techno crane reach all of the rooms to get the views that it needs? We were in the very earliest stages of previs. Previs wasn't named at that point, I would
mm,
say. I mean, I was on the previs committee in 2004, where I think it was formalized.
mm,
Um, so in 2000, we knew that we could model architecture, and we knew we could model and animate film equipment. So we built that set. We built a super techno crane, um, and we had the key grip run it. So I think unprecedentedly, this was the director was not involved It was the key grip saying, this is what the camera is capable of. No, so this is what the grip equipment, the Super Technocrane was capable of. Now let's see what that path needs to be. And then we'll move the set and design the set back to the Super Technocrane. And we'll build it 25 feet in the air, and a massive rig for that Super Technocrane on track that is not going to be shifted by, 2 feet on the day.
Mm.
And having worked that out and done, very pragmatic previs for a very, not just so that the studio thinks that a movie's being made that's real or whatever. There's the previs turned into a marketing tool, completely useless to the filmmaker. But in that case, that shot not only was planned entirely in advance digitally, but I think Stephen did 3 takes and we wrapped by 11 in the morning.
Oh, wow.
So you could have imagined trying to do that before that
Yeah.
technology was possible. Even, I mean, we would always have had models and, you'd be, but this was being able to animate the way that the Super Technocrane could extend and rotate and track. So I think a lot of that was happening. I think the vertical car chase was something also across the board planned. So we 3D printed models of the vehicle. We 3D printed or CNC cut full scale model. We mapped all of that in previs. The whole scene with Tom Cruise was done frame by frame. That scene only existed because of that research we'd done and that design we'd developed out of the sort of notion of autonomous car. So the vertical car chase was fully formed 6 months before it was shot.
Wow.
You can put previs next to the final footage frame by frame. It's pretty much an exact match. So that level of technology was really, kicking in, and that was reverberating through the art department because we were having to hire people who had the skills with the tools who had never been in an art department. So it flipped the kind of production model upside down, I would say.
That is so fascinating. That is so cool. Thank you so much for sharing all that detail. And um, really pleasure talking to you, learning about Minority Report, behind the scenes stories, plus all the other fascinating science elements. And it's really great to see what you're doing. And I truly believe that life full of accidents is probably the best life that you can live because it's completely unpredictable. And that's where the excitement kicks in. Maybe not at the moment, but as you progress in life, I feel that way.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would love to, if you ever have time, would love to chat with you again, maybe on a couple other films. But it was a pleasure having you. I really appreciate it.
I'd be happy to talk again. Thank you for your great questions.
Thank you so much, Alex. Likewise.